What is up, everybody? We got the big three back, the unholy three, the basketball trendy, whatever you want to call it. Josh Earl, Garrett Bouguet, and myself, Corbin Ford. Took a little bit of a hiatus, a much needed one, just to get our bearings together and everything going on. Movie season had to pass, all the things. Lakers had to get on a winning streak. You know how it is. But here we are, and we are back talking rosters, talking reconstruction, and we are going to be discussing for this episode the Charlotte Hornets. And Charlotte Hornets, interesting situation. Before the season started, Michael Jordan gave up his majority ownership as the Hornets end up getting new owners in the building. And that ownership group is led by Gabe Plotkin and Rick Schnall. And then a little bit after that, after the trade deadline where they went and moved off of some different guys, they hired Jeff Peterson as the new head of basketball operations for the Charlotte Hornets. And let's not forget what Charlotte did the trade deadline, letting go of, or just before the trade deadline, letting go of guard mainstay Terry Rozier, sending him off to Miami rather, and then trading longtime forward PJ Washington to Dallas, and Gordon Hayward to OKC, bringing back a variety of players, but one of which, being Trey, or a few of them, I can say them all: Trey Mann, Davis Bertans, Vasily Micic, 2 second-round picks, Grant Williams, Seth Curry, and that was the haul. They later picked up Alexei Pokashevsky off the waiver wire. But that is what Charlotte's done so far this season, as one that's been a little bit more of the same, as the Charlotte Hornets have been pretty abysmal, but also a little bit different in the sense of them finally turning the corner, letting go of some of their longtime players, trying to chart a different path, and we'll kind of see where that goes. But this is where we are right now. And so kind of want to break down with Josh and Garrett kind of where to move forward with this team. They currently sit 17-52. That is 13th in the East. They are pretty much at the bottom of everything. They're 29th in points per game. They are 29th in offensive rating, 26th in defensive rating, dead last in net rating. And yeah, I mean, when you have two of your main guys, such as, LaMelo Ball and Mark Williams, miss basically the entirety of the season, that will do it for you. But let's kind of work it around and kind of get initial thoughts and kind of go from there. Josh, Garrett, what are our thoughts on Charlotte, and just kind of let's begin the dissection that we do here.
Yeah, they're in an interesting situation because you could argue that they already have 3 pieces that are really interesting for a team that's trying to build towards being a playoff mainstay and competitive at a higher level. They've got the playmaker in LaMelo Ball. They got the big wing who can do a little bit of everything fairly well in Brandon Miller, and they got the lob threat and rim protector in Mark Williams. All 3 of those guys are under 23. If you were to take any rebuilding team and say, like, hey, you're going to have these 3 pieces, you're probably going to feel pretty good. Like, obviously, there's nothing there's no like Wembanyama here that really ups, the upside. But again, those 3 components are a really good mix for kind of building up to a really good team. The trick is going to be like putting in the right pieces around those guys, and honestly adding at least one other strong foundational piece, and then see where they go from there.
Yeah, they're, as Josh said, in an interesting position at this point. I feel like similar to the Washington Wizards, who made that decision to go into a rebuild, basically this past offseason. Charlotte finally decided to actually start selling players and accept reality, which is a good thing. That's the first step, right? Is acceptance. Yeah. And as Josh said, those 3 guys, all interesting. I think the key as well moving forward is just going to figure out, okay, well, like, who is actually our franchise guy? You know, LaMelo has all of the skills and ability to be a franchise guy, but there is an element, a question mark over his durability. He's been injured a lot the last couple of years, but then also B, his seriousness. Like, does he actually care about, the things that you would want a star player to care about, like going out there and playing hard, being focused on winning as opposed to putting up stats, and considering winning fun as opposed to thinking what's fun is just, I'm going to take an off balance 35 footer, because I think that might be interesting to try. So they do have some things to figure out in terms of who, not only what the building blocks are, but then who are we revolving our offense around? Who are we revolving our defense around? And, then you can start to make more educated decisions about the rest of the roster and how you fill around those guys.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I before we even start with the roster, I definitely want to kind of start with a question that kind of lingers here. The last piece of the old Hornets regime, if you will. I know that Mitch Kupchak is still an advisor, and contrary to popular belief, that actually was the plan already when he signed the initial deal, was to move back at a certain point and become that. So it's not like Charlotte's trying to, make it look all peachy, like this was the actual plan. So that's good for him in that case, depending on how you feel about Mitch Kupchak. But let's talk about Steve Clifford, who's back on the last year of his deal here. I think the Hornets do have a team option on that. But he is on a second stint with Charlotte, right? And it was a 3-year deal. They paid him $4 million each of the first 2 seasons. And like I said, they did have that team option about whether or not he returns. Now, obviously, the team that he is in charge of now is a little bit different than what he was last time, right? And he's spoken over the season about, hey, like, I haven't done a great job of really, instilling the defensive principles that I've wanted, or I haven't really gotten, the reaction I've wanted. So when you look at a guy like Steve Clifford, you look at the fact that there is a guy in Jeff Peterson who, in his prior stop in Brooklyn had a relationship with Steve Clifford when Clifford was a coaching advisor there. So he has a pre-existing relationship there, but the owners don't have the relationship with Clifford, and even Peterson isn't necessarily bound to him. So I guess my question is, what do you think about Steve Clifford? Is he a guy, first, your general thoughts on him as a coach, and then secondly, is he a guy you would bring back next season for this initial, I guess, rebuild for Charlotte? Is he someone that you're thinking, okay, we have to make a clean sweep and he could be a coaching advisor for us or something else? What do you do with Steve Clifford moving forward?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because the last couple of years, he really hasn't done well out of the gate, right? The team has gotten off to just horrendous starts. But then, towards the latter half of the season, the latter half of last year, that team was really defending. You saw like Dennis Smith Jr. with a resurgence. And, ever since those trades at the trade deadline that they made, it seems like this team has picked up its defensive intensity and effort. And so he's always been, I think, a pretty competent defensive coach, and he knows how to instill some of that discipline and, just how to execute a scheme and get all of those things that, regardless of the talent, the defensive talent on your roster, he can get guys to just do the things that any professional basketball player can do, which is, play hard, execute the scheme that we're trying to run out there on the floor. So as far as that baseline, like, Clifford is good, but he, I don't think he's some genius X's and O offensive mastermind. And, he's also a little bit older in age. And if you're talking about typically for me, if I'm thinking about a rebuilding team, I want a coach that I can see that'll be there for the next 7 to 10 years, right? And I don't necessarily see Clifford for the long run for this organization. So is he a guy that's a, adequate stopgap till you figure out who that guy is? Sure. But, I don't think he's like the ultimate solution for this organization.
It's interesting because Steve Clifford, in his previous stint with the Hornets, had a top 10 defense with Al Jefferson as the center. So like he has proven to have a defensive impact in the past on teams where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. Obviously, that hasn't come out yet. After the trade deadline, like Garrett mentioned, they did have a stretch where their defense stepped up immensely. I think given the contract situation, and given the fact that I'm not expecting new ownership and a new GM to necessarily, like, we're pivoting right now and we're going to try to make the playoffs next season, because that's exactly what they're trying to get away from the past several years of like, hey, we got in the play-in. I think they want to build towards a higher ceiling than what they have had. And part of that might mean taking a step back. I wouldn't be shocked given his relationship with the new GM, that familiarity, the fact that he's on like a not very expensive deal, and the fact that this next season might be a season of them feeling things out a little bit more between their core three. I wouldn't say big three, but their core three, considering how many games LaMelo missed, how many games Mark Williams missed. It wouldn't be insane to me for next season to be like, let's feel this out. Let's try to see what we have with LaMelo, Brandon, Mark, and, some of those guys that we got in the trade deadline. See how things go. Like, we can always, and I hate this, but it's true, we can always fire him during the season and hire another coach. So I think it's possible that he doesn't get replaced. It's also totally possible that he does, because it's the NBA and people usually like a clean slate, and usually want to bring in their own guy. So I think it kind of depends on what the vision is for these new majority owners, and for this new front office.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on what Josh was saying there. Not that you were insinuating this, Josh, but I also don't think that like firing Clifford and hiring a new coach for next season necessarily means that, oh, we have these crazy expectations. You can hire a new coach and still just say we're going to build out our culture and take the right amount of steps to get to where we want to go. I feel like Mark Dagnall with the Thunder is a perfect example of that. They hired him. They were not great right away, but getting him in there, then the last couple of years, we've seen them take big leaps. But in part, like, he had this quote where he's saying, some of the stuff you're seeing from the current Thunder team is seeds we planted several years ago and building that culture. So, I think it'll be interesting to see, what plan they take. But Josh also mentioning the idea that Clifford is under contract, and the history of this franchise has been that, like, we're going to cheap out a little bit on our coaching staff. And, does the change in ownership change that a little bit? You would hope so, but we don't know until we actually see it.
Yeah, I'm definitely of the opinion that maybe, moving on from Clifford would be a good idea. And what I mean that is having him around, I think, as an advisor, someone who obviously experience with the Charlotte Hornets organization. Same thing with Kupchak. For better or worse, they've been around for a while and they kind of get it, right? In terms of guidance they can have, they are older guys who've been around the league a little bit longer. But at the same time, fresh start, someone to reach these guys. I do think, like you said, Garrett, defensively, these guys did have a really good resurgence after the trade deadline. But I've watched every Charlotte Hornets game, and I am not happy to tell you that's definitely fallen apart the last 6 games. So it was a brief resurgence. Some of that is injuries as well that have impacted people. But no, they've lost those principles that they had briefly. And I think that was just the difference of having genuine NBA basketball players, because before that you were starting guys who just aren't ready yet. Don't expect to Leaky Black and, JT Thorne, Nick Smith Jr., but they're not ready yet for the minutes they were getting. And when you bring in guys who've been around the league like Vasily Micic, like Seth Curry, like Adavis Bertans, yes, they have their own weaknesses and their own issues, but they're actual players who know how to play in the NBA, actual legit rotation guys who have been here and already, and that is a difference. So I think injuries have messed that up somewhat, but also, they kind of fell back, regressed to the mean, if you will.
Well, another thing, just in terms of like my philosophy around coaches, and this is something I've heard Danny LaRue talk about quite a bit, is the idea that if your coach, say, is kind of like a middle of the road NBA coach, or maybe even below that, I think, especially in a situation where, I guess, regardless of situation, whether you're rebuilding or whether you're competing for a championship, if you determine that your coach is, in either average or below average, I think it's prudent to fire that coach and try to find one of those real game-changing type of coaches. And, you might get it wrong, but you can always try and reset again, right? So yeah, I think regardless of your situation, I think Steve Clifford is a fine coach. I think you should be looking for more than fine. Again, a team like, going back to the Thunder and having Mark Daigneault, who I think has become one of the best coaches in the league, it was worth doing what they did, moving on from Billy Donovan and all of that to find that game changer, even though, Billy Donovan is a perfectly adequate NBA head coach.
Agreed. Josh, any thoughts? Or any additional thoughts, rather?
So I think there are some caveats to what Garrett's saying, in the sense that there really aren't actually that many game changer coaches out there, like, period. It's kind of like having a true Hall of Fame level, like, true franchise generational type talent. Like, they don't happen a lot. Most coaches generally are, for lack of a better term, average. My friend Mark used to call them fungible. Like, you could plug one out, plug one in, probably about the same. And I think there are times when it comes to, like, what the goals are for that season, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to what the coach's salary is and what the organization is already paying to perhaps other coaches they've already fired, there are times where you shouldn't necessarily fire a decently average coach going to pan for gold when there might not necessarily be gold, and you just wind up getting another average coach. But in the meantime, you've disrupted things. Not to saying that, like, coaching continuity is necessarily great if it's an average coach, but there is disruption when you switch out coaches and stuff. So just wanted to add those caveats. Generally speaking, I don't disagree with Garrett, though. If you feel like this coach isn't currently or in the near term likely to get your team to where you want them to go, then it's totally understandable to try to find somebody who could do that. Totally agree with that.
Yeah, and I think the history of champions, I mean, you could name a few. You could argue maybe Frank Vogel is kind of maybe a slightly above average coach, and he won a championship with the Lakers in 2020. But I would argue the vast majority of coaches that win a championship are maybe not Eric Spoelstra level, but I would say considerably above average, that are helping you. And my stance is like, I get that firing a coach and having turnover and changing systems and making things difficult on your players and not having that continuity is a challenge. But I also just go back to the idea of, like, if you're sitting there with an average coach, like, where are you going then? It's kind of my final stance on the whole thing. But I totally understand where you're coming from, Josh.
I just want to repartee with Vivek Ranadive run Sacramento. Just leaving that there for a sec, both in terms of front office and coaches. Like, eventually they got there. But
But
because
they had a
Vivek
great
is
coach
so
and
quick to make changes, you had players like DeMarcus Cousins and like most of the players they drafted played for multiple coaches over their rookie scale deals. So, like, I'm not saying that that's why those players didn't turn out the way that maybe the Kings had hoped, but that is a component of it. And like when you have that level of disruption, it doesn't necessarily help your team, even unless you actually do hit on like a game changer. So you have to be really confident that your organization knows how to identify the right type of coach for what you're trying to do.
yeah, and that example of the Kings is perfect because like they had Michael Malone in there, and the reason they fired him was essentially because what, didn't DeMarcus Cousins get sick for like a month? And they had a great record. They were performing well above the talent level on that roster. Their best player gets sick and they lose a few games. And then it's like, oh, the coach is bad. No, he's not. Like, you still have to understand the context of what's happening. And that's absolutely right, though, Josh, that if you do make this decision that, like, we're going to fire average coaches, you have to actually understand what makes an average coach and what makes a game-changing level coach.
That's true. And I think y'all both brought necessary nuance to this because yeah, I think that that's something that's important to consider. And nuance in the conversation of coaching and how that matters. As Josh would say, context matters, right? So yeah, moving from that though, I think that's a necessary point that we should have started on. I'm glad we did. But let's go into the main players. What are the main players? What are the franchise players for the Charlotte Hornets team? I mean, the tentpole stars. And kind of how do we evaluate them? And Josh, we'll kind of start with you on that.
I mostly just want to start out by prompting a question to both of you and to myself, which is like, how do we even define a franchise player in the first place? Like Garrett, earlier you were saying, you know, like, yes, those are three interesting components, but we're not sure who's the franchise player. What does that mean exactly? And how do you identify a franchise player? And also, in your answer, do you think LaMelo or Brandon Miller or even Mark Williams has any realistic shot at being that, depending on what your answer is?
Yeah, so I guess it's a complicated question. There's a lot of factors that go into it. You know, like for instance, a guy like Kyrie Irving has the skill set to be a franchise guy, but given his off-court issues, let's just call it that, and you know the way he plays, right, leads me to go like, no, he's not a guy that is going to lead your team to, you know, where you would want to go as your top guy. So my thought of a franchise guy is, okay, if this guy is your team's best player, and let's say you put an average supporting cast around that guy, if he's truly a franchise guy, you'd think, okay, your team's like in contention for, you know, not even in contention. Your team is a playoff team. And with even slightly above average talent around him, you're in the contender category. So when it comes to Charlotte and whether or not they have a franchise guy, I think it's still up in the air. I think I have serious doubt that the LaMelo is going to be that, given what I talked about earlier. That's sort of just the, I don't know how serious of a player he is in terms of like what he cares about, given some of his shot selection stuff. And, you know, there's the whole drama around like the Ball family in general and what they care about and prioritize. Brandon Miller, though, I would say like very promising rookie. a guy that plays the most valuable position in basketball, really, at the wing spot. Josh already said he can do a little bit of everything. He's shown a lot of different stuff this rookie season. He's still very young, of course. So he's a guy that, if I had to say there's one guy that has the potential to be a franchise guy, it's him. But when you're in a situation where you don't have a for sure, like a LeBron James on your roster or Nikola Jokic, like that's where this team having high draft picks and stuff, you're still, even if you have a guy like Brandon Miller who might become that, I think you should still be trying to swing for the fences to get another guy that has that potential.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question that you asked, Josh, and I loved your answer, Garrett. I would also, I guess, kind of agree with Garrett in the sense that I don't think that for sure the Hornets have a franchise guy. And for me, that's a guy that surefire you build around. Whether that's because, okay, he's somebody that makes your teammates better, he's clearly your best player, not your best player, because right now Miles Bridges is your best player, right? And where's that gone? You arguably Miles Bridges or Brandon Miller. And, right now, like, Brandon Miller is probably not ready for that. Miles Bridges is just not that guy, right? But not only someone who makes your team better, I think that also there is a little bit of being somebody that's like good for the community. I think, when I say good for the community, I mean someone that your franchise can tout as the guy. Like, again, I hate to go back to Miles Bridges. We'll talk about him later on, but you can't in good faith go, yep, Miles Bridges our leading scorer, like he's our guy. No, that for obvious reasons that doesn't work, right? LaMelo could be that guy. There's not been a whole lot of noise outside of, personally. There's been a lot of stuff in the ball camp for sure, but nothing about him personally, right? But then it comes into, okay, does he make his teammates better? Well, I don't know when he's available. And that comes to the third point for me, availability, right? Like, if you're the best player and you barely play, are you a franchise guy? You're not really helping a franchise, right? Like, that's not doing it for you. So I think it's about your impact on the floor, your availability, and I think to a lesser extent, but an important part of it as well, away from the floor and how that impacts the team. As of right now, we don't have a big enough sample size on Brandon Miller for that. We like what we see by all accounts so far. Some stuff, in college, but like as of the NBA, like nothing there, I think his play right now leaves a little bit to be desired, and there's a lot of growth left for him to do. And so we haven't seen that yet. Mark Williams, haven't seen a whole lot yet, right? Like, he was really solid last year. Play wise, is he a guy you build your team around, and maybe in a different way, more like a Rudy Gobert way than like a traditional kind of run your offense through someone type guy? But you saw what he did defensively, right? Or what he can do defensively. But he's also been injured. Like, this back injuries really messed him up for a lot of the season. And so that might be a factor. And the LaMelo Ball on paper is your guy, right? He's like the pizzazz all-star, the guy who, when he plays, the offense is humming for Charlotte, gets him going, got the fan base up and doing well, again, for himself. Like, he's not somebody that you at least are looking back. He's a young guy, but I'm not looking like a troublemaker off the court. But then availability, long-term impact of his play, because when we've seen him in, he drives decent level offense, I'd say, for Charlotte. But we've seen what happens in the playing game the last 2 seasons that they had, right? Before they missed the play entirely. Like, they got there and got smoked. So it's not like he was raising his level or the level of his teammates at that level. And yes, you could pick nits about the quality of teammates he had, but, Kemba Walker had a similar thing. And we saw, the Hornets kind of get to a spot where if you surrounded Kemba with decent starting level talent, he would overachieve. So I think right now with those 3 players, you have big question marks on if they have a franchise guy. I'm going to say yes for now, just because I don't see them getting another one on the horizon. I think LaMelo Ball is your closest bet to that. I don't see one coming in the draft. I mean, this draft right now, I've done a lot of research on it so far. And yeah, you'll find stars and guys, on weaker drafts, quote unquote, later on. But as of right now, for where the Hornets are selecting, I don't see anyone there I'm looking at that comes into Charlotte and it's like, oh yeah, they're the guy, that you at least throw your hope in, right? You're not getting him in a free agency like that. That's just what it is. And you're not getting him in a trade like that unless you were to trade LaMelo Ball. And even then, it depends on the value that LaMelo Ball has out in the market. So all that's a long way of saying that I don't think that they have that guy yet, that LaMelo is their closest bet, and there's still hope for him, but we have to see if that hope is realized.
Yeah, and, there's the whole I totally agree, Corbin, that, like, if you can't prove that you're able to actually play on the court, that's a problem towards being a franchise guy. But also, look at Steph Curry, right? He had similar issues that LaMelo Ball had in his first few years. He ended up, doing some more training to, like, strengthen his ankles. And over time, like, that hasn't really been an issue. And, he's, So, and obviously, I think we would all agree that Steph Curry is a franchise player. So yeah,
As much as
LaMelo
AD
Ball
would be.
definitely has that opportunity. And yeah, I think he also has the skill set to make teammates better, the players around him better. Like, he is a very talented and skilled passer. It's just a matter of the decision making. Like, am I going to choose to make a pass, or am I going to choose to take a step back 30-footer? And to me, like, the unseriousness that I talked about with him is he's often choosing to take the selfish play over the unselfish play at this early stage of his career. But again, he's incredibly young, and that can change. And, perhaps if like Clifford and some of his previous coaches haven't gotten that out of him, maybe that's where an even better coach can get your players to play the way they should play to maximize their potential.
Yeah. Interesting answers from you both. I agree with elements of both of your responses. I think you're correct, Corbin, in the sense that like a franchise player is a player who has an outsized impact on your team's performance. So not just, like you said, it's not just the leading scorer is our franchise player. No, it's someone who, for lack of a better term, elevates like their team's performance around them. And also, I wanted to add in an additional component that teams definitely think about that maybe doesn't necessarily get included in this conversation necessarily, which is, can you be the face of the franchise too? So not just are you on the court a franchise guy like Timmy, but like Timmy, for instance, wasn't exactly the face of he was the face of the Spurs, but he's not the type of guy. For instance, the Hornets, one of the biggest problems the Hornets have is they were dead last in attendance overall and per game. And I know we like to focus on the court stuff, but that's a massive thing for a business like an NBA franchise. And it's even bigger, in my opinion, because like you guys can tell, I'm wearing a Charlotte Hornets hat. You guys know Muggsy's my guy. I'm looking at Muggsy artwork in a framed Muggsy jersey. Like the Hornets have had that massively invested fan base before. Like one of the best we've ever seen, right? And at this point, they're not there, and part of that is because the team has not been good lately. But I think there is that added component, at least like an additional cherry on top, or that final missing ingredient that makes a recipe like stupendously great beyond just great. Is that, can that person also be like the face of your franchise? Can they be someone that not only elevates their team on the court, but elevates like the enthusiasm in that team from the fan base, from the general public, etc. And I do think LaMelo has some potential there, just given the way he plays. But I agree with you guys. I don't think they have a franchise player right now. I'm also not entirely sure that's a problem per se at the moment, given that they do have those three fairly complementary components that they can start to build with. And then you can hopefully acquire an actual franchise guy at some point. And then all those pieces together can, make things go quickly towards contention, or at least consistent performance. But I also think an interesting question, and this is just a tangent we do not have to travel down in this podcast because we have the potential to go too long if we do. But what do you do when you're a team that's clearly in a rebuilding situation and you don't have a franchise player, and it's likely you're not going to get a franchise player in the next season or two. How do you approach your offseason? How do you approach the draft? How do you approach the free agency period and approach trade negotiations from the perspective of, we have some young talent we like, but we don't have that guy. And there's not likely that guy available in free agency for Charlotte, like Corbin said. In the draft, where they're likely to pick, unless they get lotto luck, they're likely to pick 4th or 5th, most likely. Is there a franchise guy in this draft class that will be available at 4 to 5? It's possible, but is it likely? And between that and free agency and the fact that there's not a whole lot of franchise players likely to be available in trade that, Charlotte would win trade offers on. So if you're a front office and you're clearly rebuilding and you don't have a clear-cut franchise guy and there's no obvious route to a clear-cut franchise guy, how do you approach things?
Yeah, I think there's, going back to the whole idea of the trade deadline at least indicated that this franchise is going in a direction now. It's like we know we're not good right now, so if we can get some value for some of our veteran guys or even, guys that are a little older than the core building blocks that we have, then let's get those assets. If we can at least show the fans that, like, hey, we have a plan that we're executing. And if you know what our plan is, you can say, okay, that move, I get it. That makes sense. But like, again, speaking to the whole idea of like, yeah, this team hasn't done well with attendance in recent years. And maybe the fan base has shown a little bit of apathy towards the team. I think a big part of that can be boiled down to, the Michael Jordan era of we're just going to fight for the 9 seed. We're going to fight for the 9 seed. We're going to fight for the 9 seed. And there's nothing that fans are getting excited about like, oh, we could maybe make the play in and then get destroyed in the first round. Like there's nothing exciting about that. So yeah, I think if you're trying to, if you're a team that is going to be bad for the next year or two, I think the best thing you can do and utilizing your social media staff, I think is important with this as well, of delivering the messages of like, okay, here's our plan. If you're interested in knowing kind of what route we're going down, you're going to be able to understand, okay, moves A, B, and C, that all is leading us in the direction we want to go, which is we're going to acquire assets. We're going to try to strive for high draft picks to get the next star in here. And if the fan base can at least understand where the organization is coming from, even if they're not winning basketball games, if they can go, okay, I know what this front office, what this ownership group is doing, what they're trying to achieve, then I can get behind it.
Yeah, definitely piggybacking off of what Garrett said. Like, if that's the case and you aren't able to get that star and like next year is not going to happen, what are the moves in the margins that you make, right? Whether that is, making a play on a undervalued player and seeing if there's some potential that can be unearthed, right? Whether it is focusing on the players you have currently and trying to see if you can make them a little bit better, focusing on your play development system, focusing on, facilities and building that up. Like, you want to try to do your best. If the players are not incoming and you are a small market, what can you do to be more attractive to those players? Whether that is in a trade, whether there's a player that wants out and you have built up, the players on your team that are necessarily solid role players that, make up the commensurate salary and also the interest for the other team to go, we'll take a chance on him, and you get that player. Now you already have a system in place, right? Something very similar to what the Brooklyn Nets did with Kenny Atkinson back, in 2016, 2017, right? Got a team, had no first round picks, right? They weren't getting any players there. They were a big market, but they weren't getting any players there because they were just trash, right? And you got a coach who put in a system that was really fun, instilled a disciplined culture for them. You had Sean Marks at the time, who I thought was a lot higher on back then, making more solid moves to bring in veteran players that fit well, and ultimately culminate in a really good 2019 season where you opportunistically made a trade for young D'Angelo Russell, right? You were in the area to make that trade. You did that. He became an all-star. The next, you made the trade in 2018. He became an all-star in 2019, right? You have a bunch of other guys around you, veteran role players, DeMarre Carroll, you had Jared Dudley, you had Rondae Hollis-Jefferson there. You had all these other guys that really formed, a scrappy bunch, a scrappy, resilient bunch. Were they a great team? No, they were not. But they played above the level of their head, right? Made the postseason. And they lost in 5, but they made a really scrappy series against a heavily favored Philadelphia 76ers team, right? You had a Jared Allen, all these guys. So they hit in the margin in the draft because you did get a Jared Allen. You did get a Karis LeVert, right? They were opportunistic in trades, making a trade for a young star or star level player, young draft pick in D'Angelo Russell. And then they acquired, veteran pieces here and there that really helped to form a core of a decent team and ultimately attracted 2 other, 3 if you count DeAndre Jordan, 2 other star players that looked at the culture and said, yeah, they're a market that fits what I'm looking for. But more than that, they have a decent core in place that I think I can join and hopefully win a championship. And obviously we saw the stars they attracted and how they totally made the team, but the blueprint was in place. And I think Charlotte has to take that type of mindset if they aren't able to get a star, obviously forthcoming, that Brooklyn did. The only difference being that Brooklyn obviously was a big market, but in the sense of, okay, we don't really have a pipeline of talent coming up. How can we make ourselves more attractive in the future?
I think that's a great response, in large part because I think the first thing that I would do if I were the Hornets is I would try to speed up our pace. Like they were, I think they're below average in pace. They're below average in 3-point rate and 3-point percentage. They're low, last in free throw rate. And they're third worst in assists per game. Like, if you can't get that franchise guy realistically, and again, I mentioned they're having attendance problems too. And like Corbin said, build an environment that players want to play there. And I think we've seen this somewhat with Tyrese Halliburton and the Indiana Pacers this season. Pascal Siakam was willing to go there after he had postured that he wasn't going to entertain signing or staying with any team necessarily that he gets traded to, in large part because the Pacers are fun. They're fun. They get out, they in transition, they get easy looks. They shoot a lot of threes. Like, that is a style of play that a lot of players would enjoy playing within. You have spacing. You're getting out on the break. You're getting easy baskets. Oh, I got 6 points per game just from getting out on the break and LaMelo hitting me. I think that is an early way to kind of start the ball rolling towards what Corbin was saying about what the Brooklyn Nets did, which is let's rehab the perception of this organization. Even if we can't be good in the sense that we're restricted in terms of the quality of our roster right now and what have you, we can be a more entertaining, more engaging, more fun style of play for our players and for the fans. And we can start that now. And that could be, much like Garrett said with Mark Daigneault, that could be one of our seeds that we plant that then populates with a free agent wanting to come play with us. Or, somebody who's having some issues with their current franchise being like, you know what? Get me to Charlotte. I want to play with those guys.
Yeah, I just wanted to, and I agree with what you guys are saying. I just want to clarify that I don't think what you're suggesting, though, is step one of a rebuild, because you do need some sort of players in place that you think can actually fit within that sort of fun play style that you're talking about. You don't want to just say a blank slate, we have no players, we're going to play this way, because that can kind of be against the skill set of the guys you do end up having. So you do want to I do agree that, like, yeah, if you can have a fun play style, if you can make it entertaining, sure, but you also need to at least have some, again, core building blocks to do that. And frankly, I think Charlotte does have that with LaMelo, Miller, and Williams. I think they could be a team that plays fast. So I agree there, but I just wanted to clarify that, like, if you didn't have those three guys, you don't want to start with saying we're going to play this way.
I want to counter that, Garrett, because I think that's actually a great way to start a rebuild. Like, if you're starting from scratch and you have nothing and you're not guaranteed like, let's say you get an expansion franchise, right? Shout out Sonics. I don't like the idea of Las Vegas. They're oversaturated now, in my opinion. But shout out Seattle. Let's say you get an expansion franchise, and let's say because of how they usually set up expansion rules, you're not allowed to have a top 3 pick in your first 2 seasons. So it's unlikely that you're going to get a franchise player anytime soon, right? So one of the things that can help you get the ball rolling is by identifying how we want to play as a franchise in the first place. And that comes down to who you hire as the coaching staff and everything anyway. And then that influences your scouting. Because we've talked about this before on roster reconstruction. There's no such thing as best player available. It's best player available for your organization. And also, I think at this point, we're in a league where, let's say you do get a slow it down, low post behemoth that, is super efficient, but like that's a boring ass game. Like nobody wants to play with that. And like the NBA just doesn't really flow that way anymore. Now you could go that route, but I think you're actually stronger operating from a starting point of, we know what we're trying to do schematically. We don't have anything yet. So we know what we want to do schematically in terms of like the system, the offensive system, how much we want to push pace, how much we want to shoot threes, etc., that sort of thing, and our defensive system. And that helps you define your scouting process in that case. And again, we're not talking fit. None of us like fit. We're talking what's the best available for your organization, what your goals are. And if you don't have a clear-cut route to a franchise guy or to a guy who has the opportunity to be a franchise guy, doesn't it make sense to at least form an identity?
No, I agree.
Yeah, I disagree with you there, Josh, in large part because like when you're talking about drafting, I guess I disagree in terms of like when you go to that method. I agree that you should get to that method at some point, but like, if before you've drafted anybody and you've decided, oh, we're going to play fast, then you might not draft Marc Gasol because of that, even though he's the best option, the best possible player you could get to build out to start your team. So that's where I don't disagree with that being the thing right away. Now with the Pacers, like you get Tyrese Halliburton, he's a guy that's great at pace. Then I'm like, okay, yes, from here on out, let's start trying to acquire guys like an Obi Toppin, right? Like a Pascal Siakam that are good transition players, because we at least have something in here that tells us this is how we should proceed. But when it's a blank slate, I feel like picking a style might hinder your ability to draft the best possible player early on.
So here's a thought in that regard, Garrett. If you we're saying in this context that you're not getting a franchise guy, likely, right? In the first 2 seasons, you're not likely going to get a franchise guy. In that context, is it better to then build your team around a guy that is not a franchise guy, or to build your team around an identity so that you can build towards getting a franchise guy that fits with that identity? Because what you're suggesting is you just take the best player available and go from there. But what if the best player available plays a style, and we talked about this on Twitter recently, where we were talking about how KD and Kyrie are fantastic Hall of Fame level individual players who play an individual style in a team game. And like, obviously, if you could get one of those guys, that's great, right? But you're not likely going to get one of those guys. You're more likely going to get somebody that, like, let's say the best player available in that first year as an expansion franchise is somebody that plays a play style that is not conducive to efficient NBA team offense and NBA team defense. Do you still take that best player available and try to mold something around them and then totally shift your scheme and processes a couple years down the line, and therefore totally take that player out of what was working for them and kind of throw everything into chaos? Or is it better to start with, this is how we want to go, and how we want to go is often based on actual research, actual data as to like, this is what tends to work best in the league in its current context and in the likely next couple seasons? Is it better to follow that or to just go by the whim of whoever happens to be the best player available at the fourth pick?
I like this like trending conversation. I know I'm gonna let Garrett get a minute to
Garrett,
respond
like,
as well.
Smiling, like really.
Yeah,
big.
this is fun. I love this deep dive talk. I love getting us together. I'm gonna let Garrett respond to Josh if you had anything to say, and then I'll redirect it more to the Hornets focus in this case. But I definitely like extrapolating a little bit and going big picture before we kind of dive back in to the Hornets as the roster. So Garrett, if you have anything to add there.
So yeah, I definitely agree with the idea that, like, yeah, in the event that the initial players you get, say, I'll bring up the Marc Gasol, right? Like, Marc Gasol was a very good player, but he's not the number one guy in a championship team, right? So you get a player like Marc Gasol who's a little bit more slow-footed, and you're going to play like what the Grizzlies play, to grind it out style. If you, before even like drafting Marc Gasol, you decide we're going to play fast, you don't then draft Marc Gasol, and then you don't build out what I thought was like ended up being some pretty darn good basketball teams that were built around Gasol. To me, like, you draft Marc Gasol, and if he's your best player, you build around his strengths while also simultaneously trying to find the franchise guy. And if you ultimately get that franchise guy, then you can change course and get the right players to fit around him. But until you have that, to me, you're basically lowering your ceiling by focusing on style as opposed to focusing on getting the best available players in the moment.
And again, this is just where we disagree, in the sense that I'm not talking about style. I'm talking about how you want your franchise to work, how you want your franchise to operate. And this comes down almost exclusively to coaching hire and how you want that moving forward. I get your point, and you're correct, but you're not going to be good in the first 2 years anyway. Like, trying to build around the best collection of talent doesn't necessarily, it isn't going to work as an expansion franchise, at least in the way that we've seen how the NBA handles expansion franchises. I know the Las Vegas Knights went to the playoffs in their like expansion year. So it's possible, but it's highly unlikely. And you keep mentioning like you can always pivot. Like, that's a huge pivot, though, just in the context that we're talking about, from like a grit and grind team to like, we found somebody who's going to make our offense super efficient, but now we have to change everything that we've centered our team around the last 2 years. Like, that's a lot of upheaval. And I get,
but I would argue just
where
getting
you're trying to be competitive in the meantime. And there is value to being competitive as early as you can be, because it builds up positive habits. But I think you and I just fundamentally disagree here in the terms of starting from scratch. Do you go for quote unquote BPA, or do you go for a player that you know does what you want the team to do? Even if, so for example, let's say the BPA is a defensive anchor. Let's say, like, we'll go back to like a Roy Hibbert, because I used to use this example with students in the scouting class I taught with Mark Workentine, who had ties with the Denver Nuggets. And so we often would use the Denver Nuggets under George Karl as an example. If you're the Denver Nuggets, you play a mile high, you have an elevation advantage, you want to play fast. There's no point in not taking advantage of that, right? It's a built-in advantage that you have over every team outside of Utah. And let's say the best player available happens to be a Roy Hibbert-esque elite rim protector, can totally ground your defense and give you a big impact there. But Roy Hibbert's not running up and down that court, man. Just like Marc Gasol's not running up and down that court in an Indiana Pacers style offense now. In that context, is that still the best player available? Or is it better to, let's say you have somebody who's already doesn't have that star potential, doesn't have the option likely of becoming an all-star, but this player is like perfection, like Aaron Gordon for the Nuggets. Aaron Gordon has been playing at a really high level, but Aaron Gordon in Orlando is very different from how Aaron Gordon is used in Denver. And let's say you target somebody who's like Aaron Gordon in Denver, where he's doing all these other things that complement the style of play we want to play. And when we do find a franchise guy who fits what we're trying to do, he's already locked in with a perfect complement, versus this might be a better player in a Roy Hibbert / Marc Gasol type in terms of that player's initial impact. But down the line, we have to pivot everything, and like it just doesn't fit with what we're trying to do. And I think that's where you and I have the disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree in the element of like in an extreme case like Denver, where you're dealing with the altitude, that like, yeah, Marc Gasol, even though the career he had was excellent in Memphis, like if he goes to Denver, maybe he just isn't the Marc Gasol that we have come to know, right? Like that's where context, I think, can completely alter a player's entire career trajectory. But when it comes to like, you know, you were bringing up the idea of bringing in a superstar or franchise player and then having to change everything. I feel like generally that is what happens, though, when you bring in a franchise guy to a new team. There does have to be a lot of changes. But there's also scenarios where, you know, this isn't an exact perfect example, but like with the Rockets in 2018 when they brought in Chris Paul, right? They brought in a guy that hadn't necessarily played their style of basketball before, but Chris Paul is a smart enough player, a good enough player that he was able to shift from being a mid-range pick and roll guy constantly to being more isolation heavy and more 3-point heavy. So the star was actually able to adjust and fit in with what that Houston team had already built. So I think that's another thing where, yeah, you can say, oh, there's a lot of things that you'd have to change with a new player coming in. But oftentimes, if that player is as good as we're talking about, that player can adjust to what you've built.
Oh, you're muted, Josh.
True. I would counter that, Garrett, in the sense that the reason why we see this pattern of like, oh, we got this guy, now we got to change everything, is because nobody is actually like following, this is how we want to play. There are very few teams that have like their own style. And with like the ones that do tend to be pretty consistently effective. Like Miami is one of those teams that has a consistent identity. We know what they're looking for. We know how they go about doing things. The Pacers, I think the biggest thing that they've had a success this season is actually they've developed an identity. They've developed that fast break identity built around Tyrese. And I think, yes, there are circumstances where, like, if you were to get lucky early in the first couple of seasons, get somebody where you're like, they can do good team offense, good team defense on the NBA level. Like if you were to get a Gobert, yeah, now we have an identity we can kind of build around. But if you're talking about like, we've built our entire franchise kind of to do this one type of play because the talent that we've gotten to this point only works in that context at the moment. And then we have to plug in this quote unquote superstar franchise player who plays a totally different way. And now we're either maximizing the new franchise player by shifting everything to their style of play, and then we're reducing the value of the players we already have, which again, this is all a value judgment, and you can determine like, well, yeah, you clearly just do whatever you need for the franchise player, or you could just trade off those other guys. Or like, this is kind of, we've talked about the Kyrie Irving, Dion Waiters decision where like you draft Dion Waiters thinking he's the best player available, but Dion's never played off ball his entire life to that point. And so you're either going to have Dion minimized playing off ball next to Kyrie, or you're going to take the ball out of Kyrie's hands, which is where Kyrie's best with it. So like, I think for the most part, you and I are fairly similarly aligned. We just kind of disconnect on this one particular value proposition.
And I think it's just the timeline where we differ. Yeah. I feel like I agree with everything you're saying. I just think you need something in the door first before you start making those types of decisions. Whereas it feels like you're more in line of like, no, let's just get that right out of the gate and make that choice. And then all of our best player available decisions will be based on that. So yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you've been saying. It's just, I feel like,
and vice versa.
Yeah.
The reason why I believe this, Garrett, is because I think it's really uncommon to find a franchise player. So I'm one of those people, and this was a big disconnect I had with some of my mentors who used to have the idea of like, just take all the talent you possibly could, and then you can figure out a trade down the line. Trades are really hard to pull off. Like everyone acts like it's super easy and like you're going to get 29 great offers when like that is far from the truth. And everyone acts like, oh, well, like that future first, that could be a superstar. Most draft classes have maybe like 4 star, like all-star level players. Like, and sometimes you get years where there's like one Michael Redd, one-time all-star.
2000 was cursed.
Yeah. So like, I get where you're coming from, Garrett, and it is a good strategy from a theoretical standpoint. Where I come from is because I've worked with like GMs and I've talked with them, and like personally, I think the odds, the probability of you getting like a franchise player anytime soon or getting this or that like quickly are much lower than most people think.
Well, I think this was a very interesting kind of deep dive side discussion on just draft, not even draft evaluation, but long-term player fit evaluation in terms of starting from the bottom, right, as a franchise. So I thank you both for the insight here. I'm going to take it back to the Hornets just a minute and ask a really brief question because we kind of talked about franchise guys, kind of went from there. How would you evaluate, how would you rank the LaMelo Ball, Mark Williams, and Brandon Miller? Like, how would you rank those three? I guess I could start here. I would probably go LaMelo since he is kind of the straw that stirs the drink still. Then I would say Mark Williams for anchoring the defense and his importance as somebody to anchor the back line, as somebody as well who can kind of at least form the nucleus, there we go, of like a pick and roll attack with LaMelo Ball. Brandon Miller's third for me, not because of anything. I mean, yes, I ate a lot of crow with Brandon Miller over Scoot Henderson. Still not selling any Scoot Henderson stock, but also I want to see how Brandon Miller fits in along those two. If he is a guy who can make plays off the second side, right, and has some offensive creation. Right now, he's somebody who can definitely shoot the ball really well. I have been encouraged by some of the creation he's shown or flashed in moments in the mid range, which I had not seen at all in Alabama. And then also defensively, he has been solid at times as well. So like, there's still the verdict's still out on him, but I can't say anything about how good he's been up to this point because he has been really good. I just want to see. Let me just be real. Like we've seen more established play so far from LaMelo and Mark Williams together than I've seen from Brandon Miller. And I don't know if that's fair to him just due to the team context that he's played in, but it kind of is what it is for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark Williams is, I like his potential. I think he's going to be a quality, rim running defensive anchor if he can stay healthy and continue to develop. I just don't see given he hasn't shown much as a post-up threat or as a shooter, I don't see Mark Williams ever being anything more than like a role-playing type of guy. Whereas Brandon Miller has shown enough flashes as a rookie with some big games that I think he's got that capacity to develop into something pretty special. Again, like an all-star caliber guy. So yeah, I would probably go. I'd probably lean LaMelo still, just barely, and then Miller 2 and Williams 3. Again, like I think Mark Williams could be like maybe the second most important player on the team, but if we're evaluating this just in terms of like which guy is most likely to be a franchise player, I think he's very comfortably third on that list for me.
Interesting. I think both of you have very valid points. I'm not sure exactly how I would rank them necessarily, but I do think you can build, depending on reining certain habits in, like Garrett's alluded to. I think you can build a high quality NBA offense around LaMelo. I think there's a potential that Mark Williams could be the type of defensive linchpin where you could build a really good NBA defense around him. And I think those are the two most valuable impacts you can get, is somebody who can anchor your defense or somebody who basically is the driving force of your offense. Like if you can nail one or two of those, like you're in a really good position. And Brandon Miller doesn't I don't think you can design a high level NBA offense built around him. I don't think you can design a high level NBA defense built around him, but I also think he has a lot of interesting abilities and flashes where he could be a very impactful player, and potentially more so than Mark Williams or LaMelo. So I'm not entirely sure where to fall between you two. If I'm operating strictly from today, probably lean with LaMelo because he's the most proven of the three. And then probably go with Mark Williams, although I don't know if Mark Williams is at the same level as like a Tyson Chandler, Rudy Gobert, like legit contention level defensive anchor. I think there's potential there, but I don't know. And then right now, Brandon Miller's the least proven of the three, so I would put him third, but I think Brandon Miller could surpass either of those guys. I just still don't see Brandon Miller getting like an offense or a defense built around him. Whereas I can see that for LaMelo and Mark Williams, respectively.
I like that. I think that was an important question to ask just because we obviously don't feel very strong about any of these three for different reasons yet as franchise guys, right? With LaMelo being the closest to that. But I definitely want to say, like, clearly the objectively as this team stands right now, these three are the most important, right? And so just kind of taking stock of where they are, I think is something that, just need to be done moving forward. All right, now we go to the kind of question that, we got to have to address. Don't really want to, but here we are. Miles Bridges, right? I guess, first off, I kind of know the feeling of the panel here, but I'm going to ask, what would you do concerning Miles Bridges' situation? And then based off of just what you've seen, what you think might happen with Charlotte, what do you think that they will do, right? Because Miles Bridges is an interesting situation in the sense of, obviously, yeah, and we're going to let Josh start with this first, obviously, but obviously, like, we know the off the court issues, and honestly, the off the court, it's still an issue, whether or not it's something that's still lingering right now because of the legal process, however that's been settled. Like, you still see Miles Bridges, that's immediately the thing that's going to come to mind. It will always, unfortunately, probably be the thing that comes to mind, right? At the same time, there have been moments where I've watched every Hornets game where he has impacted basketball for them at a positive way. I've also seen the latter, right, where he's not impacted them at all, or at worst been actively destructive there. He's a 25-year-old, playing with this team. We know how the NBA at the end of the day is a business, so I doubt that he will not be on any team next season. My question is, do you think it should be with Charlotte? After first asking, what would you do if you were in charge of Charlotte? Which, like I said, I feel like that's kind of an anticlimactic answer, but it is still a question I plan on asking. So, Josh, here we are.
It's a valid question to ask because we see in this industry, and not just in the NBA, but just in the sports industry in general, that production and performance can often outweigh any off the court negativity. And so, like Corbin said, I fully expect him to be with an NBA team next season. I would think that the Charlotte Hornets don't bring him back. There was discussion that like the reason they didn't trade him at the deadline was because of his contract situation. He functionally had like veto rights and he didn't want to go. So I think they're not necessarily tied strongly to him as they might have been in the past. Personally, I would thank him for his time in Charlotte. Myself personally, I probably wouldn't wish him well, but I could understand a franchise being like, best of luck. See ya. like he would not have a place in my organization. And I think that's another thing that, and we've had this discussion, Corbin and I, multiple times, where does morality come into play? And obviously most organizations do not factor it in. Most organizations do not factor it in. If you're talented enough, they don't care. And it sounds callous, and it sounds like I'm a bleeding heart liberal who just doesn't want these pro players to get past the allegations and be able to resume their careers. No, like, as a business, you choose who you engage with. You choose who represents you. And so you can pay this guy to retain him because dude averages 20 points a game. That's awesome. We love that. But you're alienating a lot of people who have gone through the type of trauma that he put someone through. And you're doing it for a guy. Let's be honest. Miles Bridges isn't a franchise guy. And even if he was, you guys know me, I'm not a big Kobe fan because of what happened in 2004 in Colorado. I won't go into it further than that. But like, even I've had this conversation with an NBA front office exec at the time when the Kobe stuff was going on. And somebody asked him, like, would you still get Kobe? Like, do you like Kobe, and would you still try to trade for Kobe? And the front office person said, hell no, I don't like him. he's um, but I would trade for him in a second, and I would sign him in a second. And I get that that's the operating procedure for most organizations. I feel organizations don't have to do that, though. If you're good at your job, you can find talent, even if it's just on the aggregate, that can replace what Miles Bridges brings without all the stuff that he brings off the court as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was all extremely well said, and yeah, I agree. I don't even know if I would thank him for his time. I think I'd just say, here's the door. But speaking to predicting what the Hornets will do, though, I might slightly disagree in that, if he's not if the Hornets don't want him, why is he even there currently? Because they had what the choices that Josh was talking about, they had this season, and they chose to, have him on their roster. So, Josh is pointing out that it is a different front office. That is fair. But you also pointed out that most organizations don't care about morality. So if that is the case, there's a decent chance that this new front office doesn't care about morality either. So, yeah, if I had to predict, I think he's back in Charlotte.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I've been torn. I've gone back and forth on that. Because on the one hand, I do think, new front office. We'll see what Jeff Peterson thinks. We'll see what the Hornets think. We'll see what's happened. If MJ was, as just pointed out in the chat, a majority owner, yeah, he definitely would be back. And I don't know if that's just, I don't know, that it was just old guard or whatever the case may be, but he definitely would be back. As it stands right now, I don't see why he wouldn't be. I see all reasons why he wouldn't be. I don't just see why Charlotte wouldn't do it, right? I don't know enough in the new front office. They haven't been they haven't said anything one way or the other yet, and maybe that's just keeping cards on the table. Maybe it's not, but there certainly hasn't been anything from what I've seen to lead me to believe that they will. At worst case scenario, it's just we don't talk about him. It's one of those things where we keep them, we just don't mention them. They could say, hey, the legal process played itself out. We can't really do anything about that. There is a certain level of morality, as far as taking a stand, that teams can or can't do. And if teams want to go, hey, he's already gone through the legal process, charges have been dropped, whatever the case may be, not saying it's right, but they're in the right to do that. And if Miles Bridges is the type of player that they look at and say, okay, he's worth the, select fan outrage that we will get from that, then they will say that, right? And I mean, I've been following the Hornets for at least the last 2 years, and I've seen certain elements of the team go, hey, I will not be a fan, but I will say the majority of them still are. They just don't talk about Miles Bridges, right? Or even I watch the Hornets broadcast and they'll be like, oh, what a play by Miles Bridges. Now, I will tell you one thing, I will give credit to the Hornets broadcasting team. They don't fawn over him. When he makes good plays and does good, they will call it out. But there's no extra stuff that you definitely saw years ago on Miles Bridges, right? And so I think that's kind of their stand there. With that being said, I can see that playing out another 2 years or so. Would that be right? No, but at the same time, he's probably, as of right now, after the three guys we mentioned, your best player. Regarding health, considering where LaMelo is right now, where Brandon Miller is in his development, and Mark Williams as well, you could argue that he is your best player. Now, you kind of see the ceiling of a best player Miles Bridges team, but at the same time, you could make the argument, right? And he is somebody who could score relatively efficiently, right? And that's just something that he has as a basketball player. So I kind of go back and forth on that because, again, you want to give hope to a new front office, but I would not be surprised if I saw Miles Bridges back next season.
Yeah, he's young, he's talented, and he's, shown to be at various times a successful basketball player. So, yeah, if as Josh said, there are a lot of organizations that don't necessarily care about what you've done off the court, he's going to have a market. The extent to what level that is still up for debate, but I would be shocked if he's not on an NBA roster next season. And, I would be mildly surprised if it wasn't Charlotte.
For sure on that. Josh?
I feel like, I want to pivot away from talking about him because he gets too much discussion that more than he warrants, in my opinion. But I wanted to bring up, because we haven't touched on it yet, the trade depth that came in, and how, like, again, I'm not sure these are great players, or this is the rotation that was going to, like, take the Hornets to the actual competitive level. But, like, they did get Grant Williams, Vasily Micic. They have Cody Martin back from injury. Nick Richards is a very solid rotation big in the NBA. Seth Curry, if they pick up his non-guaranteed $4 million, is an elite shooter. Trey Mann has shown really nice stuff in his Hornet stint so far. And I'm curious what you guys think about the roster as it's currently projected for next season. And you know, what's that look like just as is, and where are potentially obvious positive tweaks that they can make based on what that roster is likely going to be. And then I guess factoring in if you think new coach or Clifford.
Yeah, I think they've got some interesting pieces, and to be honest, it feels more to me like this team could be a strong defensive unit with a couple of additions. You talk about those two centers and Mark Williams and Nick Richards, like those are two quality defensive centers. You've got some wings in there, and Brandon Miller, who has shown some defensive potential. I've always liked Grant Williams. Grant Williams isn't some amazing game-changing defender, but I think he's a solid guy with strength, and he'll execute your scheme and take charges, those sorts of things. And even LaMelo Ball, despite the fact that he's mostly not cared about defense throughout his career, like we've seen with his brother Lonzo, he was a very good defensive player. LaMelo's got, even better size and maybe even a little bit more athleticism than Lonzo had. So I think he's capable of being a pretty darn good defensive player if a coach convinces him that he should care about that. But yeah, I think like one of the things that this team could really use is like a 3-and-D sort of shooting guard type of player. What like Gary Harris was in his prime. I think that would be a nice addition to this group, and somebody that I think, that type of player, I think is generally someone that you could actually get in free agency, even for a team that isn't like one of the best markets in the NBA.
Yeah, I definitely like some of the ancillary pieces that Charlotte's picked up. I think Grant Williams, same age as Miles Bridges, 25. So you could say he's young. I think he definitely fits a role in Charlotte that, then doesn't come with the expectation I think that Dallas did bring. But somebody who, can bang a little bit as an undersized four, provide some spacing, some relatively sneaky playmaking. He's already been good for the culture there. And honestly, I think his stuff in Dallas was overblown. I mean, there was an example basically given, I think it was one, I forgot who shared it on social media, but basically like, what happened? Luka wasn't bringing the requisite amount of energy to the game. So Grant Williams came and started like getting in his face, kind of making things tough, talking trash, all the things. And then Luka went off and it was like, oh, wow, he cooked Grant Williams. Well, that's exactly what he was supposed to do. Like Grant Williams was probably trying to get that out of him. Like, do I think he acts a little bit from what I've seen as a viewer who has no access to the locker room or anything? Yeah, maybe, but I don't think it's like a locker room lawyer or anything of that sort. I think it just didn't work personally for Dallas, and it has worked so far for Charlotte. So I like him. Cody Martin, he's a weird fit because he's played kind of out of position. I think he's definitely more of a wing, and he's played more point guard at times, and he's just not that guy. He pounds the ball into the dirt and just has been, he's just not a guy like that when it comes to point guard. But I think as a solid 3-and-D wing, he can kind of play that position pretty well. And I'm just glad he's healthy because he's been unhealthy for a good bit of his Charlotte experience. So that's good. I do want to turn to the point guards that they picked up in the trade, Vasily Micic and Trey Mann, both from OKC. Vasily, 30-year-old rookie, but, long career in the EuroLeague. We've seen, his play really pick up in Charlotte, right? Both his scoring, his efficiency, his three-point shooting is coming back after a pretty rough stint in Oklahoma City. And then Trey Mann, who I think has been really, really solid, right? I think he has a tendency to over-penetrate, and then once he gets in the middle of the lane, not really know what to do. But he is somebody who's been able to shoot pretty efficiently, grab a couple assists. He's played point guard for Charlotte, but I really think he's more of an off guard, and I think he fits right in along this potential core of, Ball, Miller, and Williams. But what are your two thoughts on the point guards and their long-term future in Charlotte, even their short-term?
Yeah, I mean, you brought up that they both, weren't doing much in OKC, in part because of the depth of the Thunder, but then also with Micic specifically, I think the play style of the Thunder didn't really help him succeed. I think he's more of he's operated for a long time as just a pick and roll ball handler. The Thunder like that drive and kick game. So, he just wasn't a good fit there. And we've seen that when he's got the ball in his hands a little bit more, he obviously has a ton of passing chops. And then, Trey Mann has always been a guy that I think has shown some flashes of talent. He's certainly got a decently high skill level. It's just, he's playing behind Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Jalen Williams, and even Cason Wallace this year, who has been an impressive rookie. So, just giving him some opportunities, I think, he's another guy that I wouldn't be counting on, but sure, I'm happy to just kind of see what player he can turn into. If anything, he's a flyer. And then also someone we haven't mentioned yet, Nick Smith Jr., another guy that I think is a flyer. He's shown a really good ability to shoot the 3-point ball, and that is a good building block for guards. He certainly needs to work on his 2-point game, the floater game, the finishing, the passing, those sorts of things. But to have, even just as a very young rookie, that 3-point ball and to be a reliable shooter, that's something to work with. And Charlotte can, that player development staff can look at him and go, okay, now you've got the shot. Now what do you do when you have to, shot fake and go? We can develop those next steps of, okay, let's make you into a more efficient mid-range shooter and finisher around the basket. And then we've got an all-around intriguing young player.
I don't really have much to add. I think Garrett nailed it on those two. I do think it's nice to have some depth there, considering LaMelo's injury history, and also just considering LaMelo's injury history, just having depth, period, even when he's healthy, I think is very beneficial. And obviously, given the size, at least, of LaMelo, Garrett has alluded to, defense doesn't always have the motivation or that sort of thing. But in theory, he can play next to Micic for stretches. He can play next to Trey Mann for stretches. And I think those guys will work perfectly fine with this team when healthy.
For sure. I think now I want to kind of wrap up. Not even wrap up. I guess we'll wrap up here. We got two more questions. One is, we've kind of talked about most of these Charlotte Hornets players here. Are there any players that you are particularly impressed by, ones of note that haven't been discussed that you want to kind of bring up here? This kind of the odds and ends part of it, because I obviously Trey Mann's my guy. I just really feel pretty strong about how he could fit in. He's definitely young enough at 23, definitely shown flashes, like you said, Garrett, just kind of the mix there in OKC. More for Micic wasn't a good fit, but you could say the same for Mann, right? And now he's in a spot where he can kind of grow and improve, kind of put more of his own kind of stamp on his game and how that relates to Charlotte. But are there any players on the roster to look at for any reason that you're like, you know what, an interesting kind of person to keep a note on moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, we've brought up basically everybody, I feel like, at this point. And Nick Richards.
Davis Bertans, I didn't hear that name. I didn't hear Davis Bertans come out, Garrett.
Richards is a guy that we brought up as a quality backup center, and we don't say that lightly. Like, I think he would be a quality center on most teams, quality backup center on most teams. Like, I think most teams would be pretty happy to have him in that slot. So he's a guy that, again, given where the Hornets are, maybe a lot of people don't see a lot about him, but he is a quality athletic big, plays really hard, which is what you like. And that's an encouraging thing with Mark Williams as well, is their young centers both are athletically gifted and they play extremely hard, which is a good combination to have some strong defense and also guys that can just be a terror on the boards.
Yeah, I mean, like, you two took the guys that I would say. So I guess just out of pure whimsy, Pokuševski's always funny to see. Just his body dimensions, and he's one of those guys that will occasionally, in a Bol-Bol-esque way, occasionally have one flash where you're like, that was a nice pass. Hey. Or like, hey, that was a nice dribble move there. But in reality, I think we've talked about everybody that has kind of had an impact. And I think it's an interesting group for heading into this offseason. And I'm interested in seeing what they do from here this offseason.
Yeah, and I was going to say that leads right to the last question that you actually put in, Josh. Like, what are the main changes that you'd make this offseason? And I guess I'll throw a quick hitter out there. Figure out the coach situation, right? Like, figure out what's going to go on with that. If you're going to bring Steve Clifford in, fine. If so, clearly communicate how long that's going to be. If you want him to be more of a transition guy to kind of take you into the next season, I don't know why, but fine. If you want to start fresh and go, okay, thank you, Clifford. We're going to have you as an advisor, or you're free to go another role. We're going to start from the bottom. Boom. Second thing I want to do, figure out the Miles Bridges situation, because that's a big thing that kind of has a thing on your franchise. Like it or not, like, it's going to be a thing. Like, that's why I was like, even him wanting to be a part of the Hornets. That's cute. That's nice. Probably should have thought about it a little bit before. Now it's totally out of your hands at this point. I mean, it wasn't for the trade deadline, but now in the offseason it will be. So figure that out. And then third, let's start trying to figure out the overall direction of this team. You already talked for the owners. They're trying to have a new arena. They're trying to make upgrades to the arena, rather, right? You have the new president of basketball operations, who comes highly regarded in the NBA space. Is somebody who's, just really dedicated to his job and really thorough in what he does, right? So now once you bring that coach and you start looking at players that fit, now you're really building a solid infrastructure that you need to have just a baseline good team, right? And we know Charlotte right now is not that, but what are they trying to do to get there? And so I think that is it. First, coach. Second, the Miles Bridges situation. Third, how do we build the infrastructure of this team? And those are going to be the three most important things for Charlotte moving forward once the postseason begins.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, Corbin. I think, obviously at this stage of a rebuild, player development is crucial. I think not only trying to build out a player's physicality and so they can deal with the NBA grind better, so they're more consistent, but also just you look back to a player like Larry Bird, he added one skill to his game every offseason, right? And that's what you hope that you can get out of these young players is, okay, we've seen you can do this. Let's add one thing to that just makes you a little bit more difficult, gives you more counters against NBA defenders. So, that would be an important thing. And then, in free agency, try to see what you can find in terms of somebody that, I don't have any names in mind, but just somebody that generally fits your timeline. And it doesn't have to be a star guy, but just a guy that can improve your rotation, whether that's in your starting lineup or your sixth or seventh man. I think a good example, like a couple years ago, what the Kings signing Malik Monk was a great pickup for them, and he's now likely to be maybe the sixth man of the year this year. But like some acquisition like that, a young guy that can help your team out and provide something that maybe your roster is lacking, I think should be another key thing that they're focusing on this offseason?
Yeah, I think the first obvious thing is saying bye to Miles Bridges, unequivocally. Second, and I know I kind of push back against firing average coaches or below average coaches. Well, I have no problem with firing below average coaches, but I pushed back on Garrett saying, just fire the average coach and try to find a better one. I think and I mentioned this earlier, I think the obvious initial next step to make this team more competitive and to find out what you have in those three, if they're all healthy together, is to change the system a little bit. I think you need to push the pace a lot more than they do. And that's probably going to necessitate a coaching change. So I would initiate a coaching search. I would try to find coaches that would pitch me on a scheme incorporating LaMelo, incorporating Brandon Miller. How are we going to use Mark Williams? I want to hear how you're going to do that while increasing the pace. And I also want to see an increase in 3-point rate, because I think between those two, you're going to open up more offensively for this team, and you're going to see some improvement in offensive rating. I don't expect them to make a major leap or anything, but if I've said this many times before, and it's always been the case every time I've looked, the very worst transition team scores more points per possession than the very best half-court offensive team. So, even if you suck at transition, you're scoring more efficiently than the best half-court offense. So in situations like this, your best opportunity to improve your offense is to just push the pace more. And then I think you also need a coaching change to really emphasize, let's have a set defensive strategy. Like we need a set defensive strategy, not just principles, but like a set defensive strategy. How are we going based on Brandon Miller, LaMelo Ball, Mark Williams, Nick Richards, like that group, Grant Williams, maybe Cody Martin. Like, how do we build even just the league average? I'm not even necessarily shooting for, a top 5 defense, but how do we build a league average defense with the skills of these guys? And let's really hammer that home, because any improvement on that is going to help. And then in terms of free agency and the draft, I want more shooting. I want more connectors too, because they are third worst in assists per game as a team. And if you look at it beyond the point guards in Micic and LaMelo, they don't really have a whole lot of passers per se. And if you can grease that offense a little bit more with just a little bit more ball movement, I think that would help. But that's what I would focus on: finding a coaching staff that is going to push the pace more and going to put LaMelo, Brandon Miller, and Mark Williams in more advantageous for them half-court situations when they are in the half-court. And then also, let's have a defensive identity, and it is limited. And I'm sure I might be reaching here, but it is limited based on, do you get the buy-in from guys like LaMelo? But that's also a key part of that coaching search. Can you get these guys to do what we need, even to just get closer to average offense, average defense? If that was the only thing that happened this next season, is they went from second to last in offensive rating and 26th in defensive rating to around, 14 to 18-ish, I'd be ecstatic. That'd be a great first step, I think.
Well, and just a quick final comment about the coaching thing. And to speaking to firing an average coach, it's probably, you probably it would be a harder decision to fire an average coach that like his strengths suit your team well. Whereas in this particular case, I think Clifford's strengths don't necessarily equate to like helping this young core. So yeah, I think it's Clifford is a perfectly reasonable coach, and it seems like a great guy. But yeah, I don't think where this team wants to go, I don't think he's the right man for the job.
Yeah, I agree. I would almost liken it to Tom Thibodeau coaching the Sacramento Kings. Like, just difference in fit doesn't negate his coaching ability, but it does make for a less than ideal match. But what was not a less than ideal match was this episode here. Definitely appreciate having both of you on, Josh and Garrett, as always, just talking ball and having a really good discussion on a really interesting team. Charlotte Hornets have a lot, moving forward. And I think this should be something that we maybe kind of start getting into, maybe a little bit of a series of teams that are out of the playoff hunt or on the bubble, that we can at least like start to self-diagnose and figure out, moving forward what that team looks like, right? I know we talked about doing the Atlanta Hawks. I think that'd be a really interesting one for a future installment of this, but definitely just want to thank y'all both for your time and just being on, and give a moment for y'all to share where folks can find the both of you and whatever y'all be doing.
Yeah, they can find me on Twitter at Garrett Bugay. That's GarrettBugay. And you can also check out my podcast, which these two are on quite frequently, Duncan Dynasty, Dunkin Dynasty. And I just recently had an episode with a good buddy of mine, Scott Levine, and we talked about the number one team in the East and the team with the best record in the NBA, the Boston Celtics. And we did a deep dive into them, and also did a little recap of our top 30 player rankings that we do before the start of every season. So yeah, check that out.
I am a full-time stay-at-home dad to a 16-month-old. So you could follow me on Twitter, but I'm not on there very often. And yes, it's Twitter. It's not X. Screw you, Elon. But the other thing I do besides podcasts with these wonderful people is I am a basketball career development coach. So I help people who want to work in the basketball industry, whether that's coaching, scouting, front office work, analytics, media, content, all that stuff. I've helped people all across the board take the next step in their careers in the industry. And I just work with people to identify what works best for them specifically. So not some blanket course or some blanket Q&A. It's designed specifically for you. I've done calls with Corbin and with Garrett. They can attest the personalization of it. So if you're somebody who wants to work in the basketball industry and not quite sure what your next step should be, or if you're already working in the industry, but your head is kind of bumping up against that ceiling and you're trying to figure out how do you get to the next level, email me at josh@myhoopscareer.com and we'll set up a time to have a first call and see if there's a way I can help you.
Definitely can attest to Josh being really, really good at what he does. Obviously, if you know this podcast, you know the research and stuff he does, but to have him take a personal interest in your career and give you really solid, strategies moving forward and how to maximize, what you do best and where that fits in, like, I can't speak about it enough. So yeah, definitely want to give Josh his flowers on that and encourage y'all to definitely email him if you have literally any thoughts on it, because it's something that is worth it. Trust me. Also, what's worth it is just a friendship with these two great folks. So thank you again, Garrett. Thank you again, Josh. Really appreciate your time and contributions here. You can follow me on Twitter at CorbinNBA, CORBANNBA. We got this basketball stuff. I'm doing some content with Next Pro, so you'll see some writing coming up on that. We actually just recorded our first episode of the Next Pro show. So that is up, kind of talking more about the AAU tournament, what it's about, all the details there. So definitely make sure to check that out. But that'll do it here. For Josh, for Garrett, for myself, we are Frosty. Y'all stay frosty. And remember, no one did more with less than Russell Westbrook. All right, y'all.